Tree risk assessment approach. Here's the truth most people get wrong about tree risk. Tree risk assessment is not predicting if a tree will fail, it is not declaring a tree safe, and it is not guessing. Tree risk assessment, as defined by NZA 300 Part 9 and the ISA Tree Risk Assessment Qualification Program, is a structured process. It is a method for evaluating the likelihood of failure, the likelihood of impacting a target, and the consequences of that failure. And before any of that begins, there is something critical that many arborists skip. That is the scope of work. If the scope of work is unclear, the assessment is unclear. And if the assessment is unclear, it is not defensible. Today, I'm going to walk you through the proper approach to tree risk assessment using ANSI 300 Part 9 and ISA TRAQ methodology. We'll define what risk actually means. We'll break down the TRAQ risk formula. We'll cover scope of work. We'll discuss the 3 levels of assessment. And we'll talk about professional judgment and limitations in the real world. Let's start with why this matters. Tree risk assessment is fundamentally about duty of care. Whether you're working for a homeowner, a municipality, a school district, or a commercial property manager, you're being asked to evaluate potential harm. That means your assessment must be systematic, it must be consistent, and it must be defensible. And ZA 300 Part 9 establishes the standard for tree risk assessment. It gives us the framework. The ISA TRAQ program gives us the qualification pathway and the terminology. Together, they create a shared language for our industry. Now let's talk about scope of work. Scope of work defines what you are assessing, how you are assessing it, and the limitations of that assessment. Before you ever assign a risk rating, you should clarify which trees are included. Is this a single tree assessment, a group of trees, a full property inventory? What level of assessment is being performed? Level 1 limited visual, level 2 basic, level 3 advanced. What is the specified time frame for evaluating likelihood of failure? 1 year is common, but that must be stated. What targets are within scope? Are we considering buildings only, pedestrian traffic, vehicles, playgrounds, adjacent properties? And what assumptions are being made? For example, are occupancy rates based on observation, client reporting, or typical use patterns? If these details are not defined, your conclusions can easily be challenged. Scope of work protects the client, it protects the arborist, and it frames expectations appropriately. Now let's define risk properly. According to ISA TRAQ, risk is the combination of the likelihood of an event and the severity of the associated consequences. Notice what that does not say. Risk is not simply the presence of a defect, a cavity is not risk, decay is not risk, a lean is not risk. Risk only exists when there is a potential for failure, a target that could be impacted, and consequences worth considering. So let's break down the 3 components. First, likelihood of failure. This is the probability that a specific tree or tree part will fail within a given time frame. That time frame must be specified in the scope of work. We are not predicting the exact day of failure. We are estimating probability based on observable conditions, site factors, load, species characteristics, and defects. Second, likelihood of impacting a target. A target is defined as a person or property that could be injured or damaged by tree failure. No target means no risk. If a tree fails in an unoccupied woodland with no infrastructure, the likelihood of impacting a target is negligible. That dramatically lowers overall risk. This is where occupancy rates matter. How often is the target present? A residence is a constant target. A parking space used once a month is not. Third, consequences of failure. If the tree or tree part fails and impacts the target, what is the severity of the outcome? Minor property damage, major structural damage, serious injury, fatality. Consequences influence the final risk rating just as much as likelihood. When we combine likelihood of failure, likelihood of impacting a target, and consequences of failure, we arrive at a risk rating. That risk rating falls into categories such as low, moderate, high, or extreme. This is the TRAQ risk matrix in action. But here's something critical. The risk rating is not the recommendation. The risk rating informs the recommendation. Risk mitigation is a separate step. Risk mitigation may include pruning, cabling, bracing, load reduction, target management, or removal. The selected mitigation should reduce one or more of the 3 risk components. And mitigation recommendations must align with the defined scope of work. If the scope was a level 1 limited visual assessment, your recommendations should reflect the limitations of that level. If further investigation is warranted, escalation to a level 2 or level 3 assessment should be clearly stated. Now let's talk about the levels of assessment defined under ANSI 300 Part 9. Level 1 is a limited visual assessment. This is typically a drive-by or walk-by assessment. It is brief, it is designed to identify obvious defects or conditions that may warrant a closer look. It does not involve detailed inspection. It does not include advanced tools. It is a screening level. The scope is narrow by design. Level 2 is a basic assessment. This is the most common level performed by arborists. It involves a 360-degree visual inspection from the ground. It may include sounding with a mallet, probing accessible cavities, and evaluating site conditions. This level relies heavily on professional judgment and experience. The scope is broader, but still primarily visual and non-invasive. Level 3 is an advanced assessment. This is conducted when additional information is needed to make a reasonable risk determination. It may include aerial inspection, decay detection tools, resistance drilling, sonic tomography, root collar excavation, or load testing. Level 3 assessments are more time-intensive and often more expensive. They are used when the potential consequences justify the additional investigation. The key is escalation within scope. You do not jump to level 3 automatically. You escalate when uncertainty remains high and the potential consequences warrant deeper analysis. Now let's talk about professional judgment. Trees are living organisms. They are dynamic. They respond to environment, load, and injury. There is no zero-risk tree. The goal of tree risk assessment is not to eliminate risk. It is to manage risk to an acceptable level. Acceptable risk varies by site and client. A tree over a daycare requires a different tolerance than a tree over a low-use storage yard. Your job as an arborist is to provide an informed, systematic evaluation within the defined scope of work, not to guarantee safety. Clear documentation matters. Document the scope, document the level of assessment, document the time frame, document the defects observed, document the targets identified, document the occupancy patterns, and document your assumptions. A defensible assessment shows your reasoning process. It shows how you evaluated likelihood. It shows how you considered consequences, and it shows the boundaries of your engagement. Now let's talk about practical field approach. When I approach a tree for risk assessment, I mentally work through a sequence. First, confirm the scope of work. What am I being asked to evaluate? Second, what part could fail? On the whole tree, a codominant stem, a large overextended limb, a decayed root plate. Third, what is the likelihood that part fails within the specified time frame? Fourth, if it fails, what could it hit? Fifth, how often is that target present? Sixth, if impact occurs, what are the realistic consequences? This structured thinking prevents emotional reactions. A large tree does not equal high risk. Visible defect does not equal removal. Absence of visible defects does not equal low risk. You must consider the entire context within the defined scope. One of the most important skills in tree risk assessment is communication. Clients often see defects and assume imminent failure, or they see a healthy canopy and assume zero risk. Your job is to explain risk in terms they understand. Risk is a function of likelihood and consequence. Risk can be reduced, risk can rarely be eliminated. And sometimes the most appropriate mitigation is not removal. It may be pruning, it may be reducing occupancy under the tree, it may be periodic monitoring. Monitoring is a valid risk management strategy when likelihood of failure is low but not negligible. Reassessment intervals should reflect site conditions, risk category, and the scope defined in your engagement. To summarize, tree risk assessment under ANSI A300 Part 9 and ISA TRAQ is a structured, defensible process. It begins with defining scope of work. Risk equals likelihood of failure, combined with likelihood of impacting a target, and the consequences of failure. The presence of a defect does not automatically mean high risk. The absence of a defect does not guarantee low risk. We define scope, we assess, we rate, we recommend mitigation, and we document our reasoning. That is professional arboriculture. And if you want to elevate your practice, stop thinking in terms of dangerous tree and start thinking in terms of risk components within a clearly defined scope. Because when you understand the framework, your decisions become clearer, your recommendations become defensible, and your clients gain confidence in your expertise. That is the difference between guessing and practicing at a professional standard. Thanks for listening to the Arborist-podcast. Let's keep building your arborist knowledge one domain at a time. If you found this useful, please like and subscribe.